Today's episode of Culture Talks, we're going to kick it back to the 1920s.
Today we have with us 6 history specialists who will be discussing the post-war era of the 1920s. We will discuss how the Great War planted the very seeds that grew into the Cultural Revolution of the 20s. Each of us will focus on a significant figure who not only represent, but also who pioneered the 20s culture in the areas of African American pride, race relations, crime, architecture, transportation, and entertainment.
From 1914 to 1918, World War I ravaged the globe. It was a brutal and bloody war like nothing else before it, with a harsh tech disconnect no one was prepared for. Changes on the home front, like women in the workforce and the Great Migration, would be irreversible. In Europe, an entire generation of young men had either been lost or traumatized. When it was over, Americans wanted nothing more than to retreat back into isolationism. This created the perfect cultural landscape for the advancements of the 1920s.
Culture Talks, the 1920s.
Good morning, Culture Talks. Erin and Issa here, and I'm here to bring you more on how World War I influenced American literature. Its influence dates back to 1917 when the draft was put in place. At this time, many men were removed from their jobs and sent overseas to fight for their country against the Central Powers. The draft relates the two as it created the Great Migration, which was a large movement of hundreds of thousands of Southern blacks to cities in the North. Blacks moved to the North in an effort to escape Jim Crow laws in the South. The laws enforced racial segregation between blacks and whites. At the same time, jobs were lost due to floods and droughts and ruined cornfields in the South. The final aspect that made the switch look irresistible was its ability for the slaves to easily access the North, due to the fact that there were free railroad passes touted by recruiting agents from the northern manufacturers due to their need for workers. As a result, many African Americans moved to the North and inhabited major cities. One well-known city was the Harlem, New York, home to the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural movement that spread African American culture through literacy, music, and visual arts. It was a time when blacks separated themselves from white stereotypes and embraced their heritage and each other. A major contributor to the Harlem Renaissance was Zora Neale Hurston. Her idea was to acknowledge African American heritage and include African American folklore in her work. Hurston celebrated what she called the common person's art form. Her work celebrated the way African Americans lived and highlighted their traditional customs. Specifically, she wrote about slavery and poor African Americans who used inner strength to survive their hardships. Her literature encouraged blacks, mainly those of the middle class, to embrace their roots of slavery and not shy away from it as a way to fit in with society. She was also credited with her detailed writing and her ability to have a great sense of humor. Hurston's humor allowed her personality to shine through in her novels and short stories. Through her writings, Hurston was able to bring a sense of pride to African Americans. She proudly acknowledged where they came from and influenced a new type of writing that is impacted by culture and heritage that writers still use today. Issa, can you relate to that?
I can, but Marcus Garvey can't. After World War I, many Americans began to fear foreigners. This led to trends of nativism and isolationism. On top of that, the Great Migration that occurred during the war caused tensions between the races in the North. Those two things were adding up and making racism a problem across the nation. Marcus Garvey, an immigrant from Jamaica and a civil rights activist, was not going to put up with that, and he took matters into his own hands. A little before the 1920s, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and he followed plans to help create greater economic independence and essentially a separate society for African Americans. By doing that, he filled many with hope and honor in their culture. After a couple years after founding the UNIA, he moved it to New York, opening offices there to gain more followers. Along with that, Garvey attracted more followers by making practical plans, one of them being the program that would advance African American businesses. However, Garvey had one dream that he absolutely wanted his followers to do, and that is move back to Africa, overthrow the white oppressors there, and create a mighty nation. Sadly, this plan didn't work out as suspected. When he was doing that, to promote the Africans to go back to Africa, he created the Black Star Line. But in 1922, Garvey was arrested for mail fraud involving that line, and was later on deported back to Jamaica. While he was in jail, support for his campaign decreased, and the act had weakened. Although Garvey's goals suffered in the end, he did create and leave behind a legacy. Not only did he rekindle Black pride, but also economic independence and appreciation for Africa. To this day, many still refer to Marcus Garvey as the Black Moses. Through his determination and perseverance, Marcus Garvey worked against discrimination and greatly influenced African Americans in the nation. Not only did he break through racism, but also contributed to the trend of Black pride and cultural revival, both of which were major trends in the 1920s. Another one was crime. Austin, take it from there.
After World War I, the United States reverted back to a policy of isolationism. This was the act of limiting U.S. involvement in international affairs. There was a general rejection of immigrants and their cultures. Some Americans objected to the immigrants' way of life, which often involved alcohol. Prohibition was the ban on the drinking, buying, and transportation of alcohol. On January 7, 1920, the 18th Amendment enacted prohibition was enacted. Many people became casual lawbreakers rebelling against prohibition. This led to the large demand for alcohol. One man named Al Capone saw the opportunity to make a lot of money and gain influence. He started off in Chicago by becoming the best-known gangster boss by controlling saloons, distilleries, breweries, and many more gambling houses. He was reportedly making $100 million a year and ordered the killings of countless people. One of the most famous killings was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where 6 people in a competing gangster family were shot dead. Al Capone was never indicted for bootlegging or murder, but he was eventually prosecuted on income tax evasion. He went to jail and was released a few years later on good behavior. He proceeded to live a peaceful life until he died in 1947 of cardiac arrest. Al Capone had a large impact in the ages of Prohibition. Mass migration led to growing crime in cities. This urbanization led to the urban planning.
One such area of urban planning is architecture. One of the most famous architectures of the time was Frank Lloyd Wright. After World War I and during the 20s, his work declined, however. His life was also in pieces. He had several divorces during the 20s, but finally in 1928 he married his wife for life, Olga Lazarevich. She influenced him to refocus on his cause of architecture, as he did in the earlier decades. So, due to the rising urbanization, there was many problems with cities. Many architects at the time wanted to focus on fixing the modern city. They fell into 3 different categories. One wanted to transform cities, such as Le Corbusier, who wanted to build cities taller and more condensed, while others, or the second group of people, were architects who wanted to build smaller communities outside of the cities and then connect them with public transportation. And finally were the architects who wanted to get rid of the industrial city. Wright was one of these architects who wanted to get rid of the industrial city. He was very stubborn about it too. When Le Corbusier proposed his idea of the radiant city, which was to make tall skyscrapers and put interior roads connecting them, Wright countered this idea with his idea of the broadacre city. This, as you may infer, would want to make the city broader or wider. And so Wright wanted to connect the cities with spacious highways. He wanted to separate and unite the farms, the factories, markets, schools, and homes. He thought this was beautiful architecture. This could have all been possible with the rising manufacturing of automobiles during the 1920s and the already high amount of airplanes left over from World War I.
While the urbanization movement grew, it was paralleled by a growth in the transportation industry. World War I was the first war ever in which mechanized machinery was employed. It was also the first war in which airplanes were used. One of these planes was a small wooden biplane known as the Curtiss JN-4, also known as the Jenny. The U.S. Army Air Service bought about 7,000 of these, primarily for trained pilots. When the war ended in 1918, the government was eager to sell the surplus. It sold them, some still brand new, for $300. That's about $4,130 today. As a youth, Charles Lindbergh was fascinated by aviation in the war. He idolized French expert aviator René Fonck, who shot down a total of 75 German planes throughout the course of World War I. This was a major influence in his desire to fly. After enrolling in engineering school under pressure from his parents, Lindbergh later enrolled in aviation school in 1922. He began a career in aviation. It was in 1923 that Lindbergh would purchase his very first plane, a surplus Jenny still in its crate. He began barnstorming, a sort of aerial circus, making a name for himself. He continued to gain experience as an Air Army Reserve cadet, that's that one, and later as a U.S. mails pilot in 26. This industry was just recently coming into widespread use, as the war greatly improved aviary technology. That year, a contest proposed by Frenchman Raymond Orteig caught Lindbergh's eye. The first pilot that could fly non-stop from New York to Paris would win a cash prize of $25,000. Orteig had proposed the challenge in 1919, but no one had accomplished the feat. In fact, Fonck himself had attempted the feat, but failed, barely making out alive. His two co-pilots were both killed. Determined to succeed, Lindbergh found financial backing and began to search for the right company to build his plane. He decided on Ryan Airlines Corporation in San Diego. He also helped to engineer the plane. The plane was named the Spirit of St. Louis, and he would fly alone. The Spirit of St. Louis took off from Roosevelt Field. 3,600 miles and 33 and a half hours later, Lindbergh landed at Le Bourget Field near Paris. He had accomplished a feat that many had been injured or killed attempting. Lindbergh became a hero, thrilling people around the world. He came home to celebrations and parades and was honored with awards. President Calvin Coolidge himself gave Lindbergh the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Flying Cross. Lindbergh was a sensation that captivated the attention of America and propelled the adventurous spirit that marked the post-war era. He also went on tour, visiting 49 states, 92 cities, giving 147 speeches, and riding 1,290 miles in parades. His fame was propelled by the advancements of entertainment technology, such as the radio and TV, which would allow him to access millions of people. Well, Rachel, I think you can take it off from here. You would know more about entertainment than I would.
Thank you, Anastasia. In post-war America, disillusioned youth desired cheap and fast entertainment. The world had to be exciting to distract from the horrors of the previous decade. Like Anastasia touched on, technology boomed in the 1920s. Cars, telephones, and radios became widely available to the middle class, bringing entertainment into the home. Sports and other events became more accessible, as well as becoming more exciting. Baseball is known as the classic American pastime, but George Herman Babe Ruth Jr. made baseball the sport it is today. Ruth came from humble beginnings. Both of his parents passed, and he hung out with the wrong crowds. After being sent to St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys, it was discovered that he had a special knack for baseball. It wasn't long before he made it to the big leagues and revolutionized baseball as we know it. Before he came into the game, baseball was a game of playing it safe, dragging through the innings. Babe changed it all around. Instead of cautious singles and doubles, he set record after record for homers, some of which still stand. Babe's sensational performances in baseball provided the entertainment and distractions that Americans craved. With the rise of sports media, his public persona became an American icon. People identified with his attitude and story. He is a perfect match to Rich's tale. He is famously quoted saying, "I swing big with everything I've got. I hit big or I miss big. I like to live as big as I can." This attitude permeated the 1920s, a society of emerging consumerism and nationwide overconsumption, indulgence, and a carpe diem attitude. He was the symbol of this himself. He commanded salaries unheard of for a ball player and lived lavishly. The modern American could see themselves in Ruth. The public loved him, and he loved them back. He was larger than life, figuratively and literally. Sports writer Tommy Holmes summed up Babe best, saying, "Some 20 years ago, I stopped talking about the Babe for this simple reason that I realized that those who had never seen him didn't believe me." Babe Ruth remains a household name for his contributions to the 1920s and ultimately emerging American culture. It is clear to see that each of the individuals discussed made great contributions to the post-war American society. They helped shape American culture into what it is today. This is Culture Talks, signing off.
Stacy, can I come over after school?
Culture Talks has the right to this broadcast. Any form of copying is prohibited.